Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank Dr. Pratiti Ballal and Bangalore Literary Festival for asking me to this session. I read the book State Matters, this one, Kannada Sub-Nationalism and State Formation by Professor Rajendra Chenni with envy, because I wish I had written that. It is beautifully written, it is substantive, it is critical, it is nuanced, well-researched, and comprehensive. And so one gets a very detailed account of the development of the unification movement based on the Kannada language that started in the latter part of the last century, of the 19th century, and culminated in the formation of the linguistic state of Karnataka. Professor Chenni is a very distinguished critic, intellectual, and activist, well known to everybody in Karnataka, and therefore it is not surprising that this is a wonderful book. It will be a great contribution not only to the understanding of the Kannada unification movement and the state formation and Kannada regional politics in India, but also, as you will see in a minute, to Indian political science in general, and to the idea of theory of political science worldwide, because he interrogates some of the current frameworks about the notion of how nation states are formed. And so without further ado, what I thought I would do is to ask a series of questions and basically let Professor Chenni talk about the content and the significance of this book. So if I may, I would like to start with the definition of the title itself. The book is called State Matters, and it is about Kannada sub-nationalism and state formation. Everybody is familiar with the term nationalism, but people may not be so familiar with the term sub-nationalism. Would you kindly define sub-nationalism?
Well, before I do that, just a word about the title of the book. What I intended was the title should suggest two things. This is a book about matters pertaining to the formation of the state. The other is that the state matters. If you take a very culturalist view of linguistic sub-nationalism and then you try to place it in some abstract or idealistic kind of a category, it doesn't work. We'll have to look at the real politics of the time, and therefore the suggestion behind the title is The State Matters. That's the explanation for the title of the book. Sub-nationalism is now, of course, a very familiar term to most of the readers. We talk about the nation as something that is an imagined community or as a construction, and we don't, we are very clear about it, that it is essentially a construction. But when we look at the constructed identity of the nation, we find that there are a large number of groups which seem to have some kind of an identity of their own, based on ethnicity, on language, on maybe other socio-cultural factors. Now, when this is substantial and large enough, one talks about sub-nationalism. And there's another reason also why we use the term sub-nationalism. most of the frameworks which you have been using, the theoretical frameworks, in order to understand what a nation is or how it is formed, etc., more or less, I'm not saying this, absolutely the same categories are used to discuss sub-nationalism, but there's a great deal of analogy between the way we think about the nation and then the way we think about a smaller group by using the term sub-nationalism. Here I'm talking about linguistic sub-nationalism with particular reference to the formation of the Karnataka states.
You go into the details about the notion of Kannadatwa, the relation, how the idea of a Kannada state, a Kannada Nadu, has its origins as early as in Kaviraja Marga of 9th century. And there is a collocation between the Nadu and the Nudi, that is the language and the land. What was the status of Kannada before the unification movement began and before the state formation?
The status of Kannada or Kannada Nadu?
Of Kannada Nadu.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
or Kannada in what is now Kannada Nadu.
Okay, the straightforward answer is there was no Kannada Nadu, strictly speaking. In my book, I talk about two categories. One of Kannada Nadu as a historically evolved category, and the other is where many thinkers conceive of it as a transcendental category. So I have made the distinction between the two because in the very long cultural and literary tradition we have had in Kannada and in the pre-modern Kannada Nadu, there was the notion of a Kannada Nadu. There was the notion of a Kannada polity, even in the pre-modern period. So when we talk about Kannada sub-nationalism, we need to take this also into consideration. As you mentioned, the first extant text of poetics we have, Kaviraja Marga, which is dated at 850 AD. This clearly mentions two things. One is the geographical boundary of the Kannada Nadu, from one river to another, from Kaveri to Godavari. And it then goes on to talk about the people who inhabit this territory. And it also talks about some of the cultural features of not only the Kannada Nadu, but also those who dwell in Kannada Nadu. So as such, if we are looking at both these dimensions, I mean, as a transcendental category and also as a historically evolved category, one can say that the conception of the Kannada Nadu has existed for maybe over 1,000 years at least, going by the texts available. But when it comes to the talking, when we're talking about the formation of the modern linguistic state within the federal structure of India, it's a very modern thing. And the unification movement began towards the end of the 19th century. Yes.
Right. So we are familiar with how the Ekikarana, or the unification of Karnataka, is celebrated in popular narratives. Part of it is rhetorical, and you criticize some of it as being uninformed and making use of worn-out models of history writing. You also talk about how, in part, it is chauvinistic, in part, it is paranoid, it's anxiety-ridden. It's a model of Kannada identity that describes it as being threatened by the other languages, such as Marathi or Tamil, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the position that you take is more pluralistic, pragmatic, a clear-eyed analysis that you adopt here. So my question is, how is your analysis different from that of the currently available analyses or popular narratives?
Okay, if we're talking about popular narratives about Kannada, and especially about the unification movement itself, the impression that is given to us is that it was a spontaneous movement on the part of the Kannadigas, and it simply flooded modern history, and then it went on to create a very harmonious and homogeneous land for the Kannadigas. All these are myths. The truth is that the formation of Karnataka as a modern state is extremely complex and complicated. On the one hand, there was the negotiation with the colonial modernity, which in the first place brought to the elite, at least, the elite middle class in Karnataka, notions of democracy and nation and nationalism. And then there was the impact of the Indian Renaissance, which had made its impact on most of the regional cultures. Then there was the politics at the national level, the Congress politics with Mahatma Gandhi supporting not sub-nationalism as such, but at least the formation of the Pradesh committees based on linguistic identity, and also his emphasis on the first language or the mother tongue. All these, large number of factors actually led to the rise of the Kannada consciousness, which in turn was given some kind of a support of a political will, and all through the Kannada sub-nationalist movement, Ekikarana movement, worked within the rubric of the national politics, including the Congress politics. So therefore, it was not a question of a very homogeneous, a very spontaneous movement, as I said, almost flooding and then maybe closing up all the asymmetries and inequalities, class distinctions. Nothing of that kind happened. We have to be very pragmatic about it. Therefore, I thought we should adopt a very pluralistic view. Then you need many perspectives from which to understand how this movement, which went on for nearly 60 to 70 years, how did it sustain itself? How did it begin as a culturalist movement? And then it reached many sections of society. And then there were problems of regionalism in the so-called Kannada Nadu. And Kannada itself, if you look at the way the Kannada-speaking community was scattered, it was scattered over 29 fragments. And I don't think such fragmentation has been experienced elsewhere. 29, and some scholars would even count it as about 31 or 32, apart from very large ones like the Nizam's, the territory which was controlled by the Nizam, and the Mysore Principality, etc. It's in a way very amazing that Kannada was not the language of administration outside Mysore Principality, nor was it the medium of instruction in the Hyderabad Nizam's territory. Urdu was the medium of instruction from the lowest to the postgraduate in Nizam's Hyderabad. So this was, it just didn't exist. What fascinated me was that there was nothing called a modern Kannada Nadu. And then there was, of course, you were mentioning some of the problems with the popular narratives. The popular narratives are partly like hagiographies, biographies of very charismatic leaders and how they sacrificed themselves. That's one part of the popular. The other is these communal or tinged with communal histories of Karnataka, where the myth of the Kannada Empire, Vijayanagar, being attacked and destroyed by the so-called outsiders. referring to the Muslims, you see. These are part of that, and of course I'll stop after mentioning one. The Kannada unification movement also created new deities, and one of the deities was the Bhuvaneshwari and then Rajarajeshwari, as though, this national sub-nationalist movement was creating a space for the woman. No, it did not, because the Kannada unification movement was seen as male business. So apart from the two imaginary goddesses, the presence of the women was there, but never acknowledged.
Yeah. That's, it's an example of how beautifully you develop the historical context of the development of the unification movement and the demand for a Kannada state. And in the process, you describe how it was non-linear, in the sense that there were many pushes and pulls and going back and forward and things like that. And there were many fault lines, and how there was an intersection of caste considerations, fear that the less developed people might affect the development of more developed states such as the Mysore part and so on and so forth. And also the fear of the domination of Lingayats as opposed to Okkaligas, all of that part. And also there was this very interesting relationship between Kannada and Samskrita on the one hand, and Kannada and English on the other. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that part. So you talk about how, for example, the relationship between Kannada and Samskrita was not confrontational, whereas later the relationship between Kannada and English became partly confrontational. But on the other hand, English was also treated as a liberating influence on the part of people like Kuvempu, for example. On the other hand, at the same time, English is also thought to be a threat to Kannada, and so on and so forth.
As far as this analysis is concerned, I have drawn on the excellent scholarship of Professor Shetter, the great historian. And in his works, he pointed out that this kind of a very adversarial attitude that you find in, for example, the Tamil Nadu about Sanskrit is not reflected in the Kannada texts of the pre-modern period. There's a more accommodative kind of attitude, and the modular forms, in prosody, in literary forms, they're all taken from Sanskrit. And that is one of the points I try to make, that the distinctive aspect is that going by the texts available to us and the exegesis of the text, the attitude of most of the poets and the scholars in pre-modern Kannada has been to treat Sanskrit as a pan-Indian model with which one has to negotiate. Of course, you do acknowledge your own distinctive differences, but you take it as some kind of a large rubric under which you work. That I wanted to. But when it comes to the discussion of English, in one part of my book, I have talked about it, in the sense there is a whole history of the conflictual, ambivalent attitude towards English. Professor was mentioning Kuvempu, the greatest Kannada writer. He had said that if it were not for English, as a Shudra, perhaps I would be scrubbing vessels in a Brahmin home. He said that. And he wrote his first poems in English until he was advised by J.H. Cousins not to write in English but to write in Kannada. But thereafter, there was a very different kind of a perception that developed in Kuvempu, because the same Kuvempu went on to say that English is like a putani, the woman who wanted to feed poison to the little Krishna. And he also made the statement that in every college examination, thousands of Kannada youth are guillotined, as it happened in the French Revolution. They are massacred on the guillotine of English, etc. So there is this, and that I think is somewhat of a, it reflects the very ambivalent and conflictual attitudes towards English, because one of the huge controversies we had was when the Karnataka government decided to introduce English at the first standard itself. There's a huge controversy which led to a polarization of the writers and the intellectuals. The Dalit writers took the view that the others, for them, the others, they had already taken advantage of modernity through English, and now they were insisting that the Dalits should learn only in Kannada and not in English. This was one of the things that happened. I think it continues even now in different avatars. This conflictual attitude continues. And I have also mentioned in my book the different shape given to this dialogue and controversy because of globalization. Once again, with English now becoming very much the language of power and the language of the international finance capital. I have also mentioned Bengaluru, because there is also this notion of Bengaluru versus Karnataka. So you need to talk about how different sections of society have responded to it. So.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I will just end with one last question. I think your analysis is beautiful and nuanced, as I said. But it also raises very interesting questions about theoretical models that are used for to explain the idea of a nation state, or even a sub-national state. There have been models by, for example, Benedict Anderson about imagined communities and things like that. And there have been metaphors of a salad bowl or a melting pot and so on and so forth. And you reject all of those things. And you say that that's not appropriate to explain the nature of and complexity of the state formation model that took place in Karnataka. Could you please elaborate on that a little?
One of the problems I confronted was most of the theoretical models, Eurocentric models, they evolved in a monolingual, monocultural situation, essentially. And lifting them up and then applying them to such a heterogeneous and multilingual and a multicultural context, I felt would not be very appropriate. It wouldn't just have that kind of a explanatory efficacy which you expect from a theoretical model. And that's the reason why I examined most of them. This has become some kind of a fixed model, Benedict Anderson, imagined community, print culture, etc. Then you go back to Herder and the German philosophers and talk about one culture, one language, when we have never had that experience in history. Never had that kind of an experience in history. And I think it necessitates different kinds of theoretical models, you see. And that I have tried to examine in my work, because I was looking for a more supple and more, what should I say, multiple oriented way of looking at how this happened.
Yes, this is one very good example of how a careful, in-depth, insightful, culturally rooted analysis of one province, such as Karnataka, can throw light on theoretical models that apply to the world as a whole, and therefore interrogate global models and suggest a better, more universal model that was needed to explain India. So thank you very much for doing this. It's a wonderful book. Yeah, if we have a couple of minutes, so if there are any questions. So you don't have a session now? No, they don't have a session now. So if you have any questions, please.
Sir, this was a wonderful session. My question was that Kannada has a lot of dialects. So what kind of a difficulty did it pose to the formation of the state? Is that?
I have discussed this in a chapter where I talk about the search for the standard dialect of Kannada. Interestingly, it begins with Kaviraja Marga itself, the 9th century text, where he talks about these geographical dialectal variations of Kannada. And he says that there are so many that even Adishesha, is not capable of handling all of them. So, and he also interestingly points out, and that has been reiterated by our first poet, Pampa, that the dialect spoken around one small geographical area, today's Badami, Koppala, etc., was known as Thirul Kannada, which translates as standard dialect of Kannada. So what you see is, because of the shifting boundaries, political boundaries, shifting routes of international trade, which Karnataka was known for, the standard dialect also has been shifting, because the choice of the standard dialect has nothing to do with the characteristics of that particular dialect. It's always a political process. It's a part of the cultural politics which determines what the standard dialect is. So by the time you come to the 20th century, this has shifted, and you find that for a long time, the regional dialect spoken in North Karnataka was used only in farcical comic films in a very derogatory manner. Okay, so it shifted because of how Navodaya happened and which were the epicenters of Navodaya and what was the political clout of certain regions. We need to look into all that when you talk about the standard dialect.
If I may add just one footnote to this, in Kaviraja Marga, the author actually talks about Kannadangal. He uses the word Kannada in the plural. It's like saying Kannadas. And it's very interesting that today, the term world Englishes has become a popular and established term. There is a journal, and there are many courses, there are conferences, and so on and so forth. We work on that. So this concept of a language existing in a plurality in many different forms, and many of them equally valid and justified by their cultural context. That insight our Kaviraja Marga author had 1,000 and more years ago. There was another question?
Sir, multiple social complexities such as construction of caste, Brahmana and Lingayata, how far they have contributed to the issue, the process that you have dealt with in your book?
Specifically?
Construction of Brahmana, caste and Lingayata.
Which process?
Multiple social complexities, I said, of that period.
Contributed to which process?
Which process?
To the formation of Karnataka.
Professor had asked a question about it. When the unification of Karnataka almost became a reality and we were moving towards the formation, what happened in Karnataka was that many of the leaders from the Mysore region, they started saying that there should be two states, and that they were not willing to think of a Karnataka which would integrate all the different regions. The reasons given were two. One, many of them were very backward. When Madras presidency gifted Bellary, there were no takers, and there was also, and they wanted to return it with compliment. True. This is true. And then it was said in the Mysore Principality, in the assembly itself, that if you take over these economically backward regions, there would be a terrible burden on the exchequer. You see? Fortunately, a host of Kannada writers and scholars and politicians stood against this and said, we want an integrated Karnataka. The other calculation was that there would be naturally demographic changes. If there were to be a unified Karnataka, then the Vakaligas were very dominant in the Mysore Principality. They would be losing that hegemonic status because Ligayas from North Karnataka and other regions, they would be at least, they would be more dominant, and therefore resolution after resolution was made saying that they do not want one Karnataka, and maybe we could have two Karnatakas. Thank God it didn't happen.
There's one more question.
But please remember, I don't want to end by giving a very negative view of what was happening in Mysore. Some of the finest writers in Karnataka, like Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, later Anakra, and many others, they were very clear that there will be only one Karnataka and one Kannada Nadu, and all regions would be welded together. And that's what Shantaveri Gopal Gowda, the great socialist, argued in the assembly.
Good evening, sir. My name is Vinay. The primary torchbearers of Tamil sub-nationalism is the cinema. Likewise, who are the primary torchbearers of Kannada sub-nationalism? Thank you.
As soon as this Kannada consciousness developed, I'm not going into the details here, it is a part of a very long process, starting with the contribution of the British missionaries and scholars who in fact formulated the very idea of the Kannada literary tradition, Kittle and Woodth and many others, you see. And they were the ones who made arrangements for the circulation of these old texts, not in the regional sphere, but in the secular sphere, where every reader would have access to the classics of Kannada. So starting from that, there were contributions which came from practically all forms of expression, including films, you see. Because the important thing culturally was to create a cultural imaginary of the Kannada Nadu, what it was, what it consists of. And to that, the contribution came from practically all walks of life, including films and film lyrics and songs, and then associations, literary associations, and of course there were huge all Karnataka associations like the Sahitya Parishad, which played a very dominant role in supporting unification. Karnataka Vidyavardhaka Sangha in Dharwad. There were many such institutions. So there was institutional support from the nascent and growing media, and also from the journalism of the time. Journalism played a very crucial role, in consolidating the opinion, especially in that fallow period after independence, because of Nehru's reluctance to formation of linguistic states and the permanent cowardice of Karnataka politicians to raise their voice against the diktat from the center, it went on being postponed for quite a long time after independence. We had to wait till 1956. And in 1956 also, the Karnataka state came into existence. It was not called Karnataka, it was Mysore. So one of the wonderful things which Alur Venkat Rao, supposed to be the high priest of Kannada unification, said was, he sent a one sentence congratulation for the formation of the state. I congratulate the formation of the state, now wrongly named. These are his words. He said, now wrongly named myself.
I think maybe on that note we can. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.